Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today on finding the right program and advisors. We'll be presenting today. We're two PhD candidates associated with Project SHORT. I'm Lori Belstead, a PhD candidate at the University of California, Davis.
Hey everyone, my name is Enrica Bridgewater, and I am a PhD candidate at the University of Michigan.
As Sarah mentioned, the materials from this presentation will be available via the Google Drive link, as well as the recording posted to YouTube. Do note that there's additional resources for applying to grad school on the Project SHORT website. We've included a QR code here. This will also be available in the slides that we share with you afterwards. So we want to start today with a little bit of a graduate school overview. So what is grad school? When do I need to start thinking about applying? And what are some of the different types of grad schools that are out there? So in general, your applications will be due sometime between November and January. Right now, in this kind of August to October window, is when you want to start identifying possible programs and advisors, as well as take the GRE if necessary. As we start to kind of approach October, this is when you're going to want to start to think about asking for letters of recommendations and reaching out to potential advisors, especially if that's something that's a common practice in your field. After applications are turned in, usually sometime in February or March, if you're accepted for an in-person interview, you'll get notified about that. And then after those in-person interviews, acceptance letters will be sent. And then April 15th will generally be your last date to accept a graduate school offer. Today, we're going to be focusing mostly on reaching out to potential advisors and identifying programs and possible advisors for graduate school. Graduate school applications tend to have 5 main components. So there's an application form, a research statement, a personal diversity statement, a CV, and an application fee. So your application form is just general information about you. This will vary university to university, but generally things like your name, where you got your bachelor's degree, and what sorts of things you're broadly interested in. Your research statement will include a longer essay that's about what sorts of research questions do you want to answer while at a graduate program. Personal diversity statements will include how does a graduate degree fit into your personal and professional narrative. Your CV lists out your different academic accomplishments. And then application fees vary program to program, and you should always check for waivers as you're applying to programs. And as Sarah said at the start of our webinar, later workshops by Project SHORT will focus on all these different components of an application, so stay tuned for those.
Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit about some vocabulary about all the different potential, well, not all the different, but many of the different potential types of schools that you all might encounter as you start looking for programs. So the first is like Ivy League or R1, R2 institutions. So these institutions tend to be very research intensive, which generally means that conducting research will be a very big part of your time as a grad student. And like Ivy League institutions usually fall under like this R1 category due to their very high research activity. And then we also have like public versus private institutions. So generally, public universities are usually funded by the government, whereas private universities are funded more so by tuition and endowments, which may not necessarily impact the resources available to students, but they could. And then third, we also have minority serving institutions. So MSIs are schools that primarily serve minority populations. So some of these include historically Black colleges and universities, or HBCUs, Hispanic serving institutions, tribal colleges and universities, and Asian American and Pacific Islander serving institutions. And then we also have like liberal arts colleges. So usually liberal arts colleges tend to focus mostly on undergraduate education or undergraduate programs. However, some do offer graduate programs in subjects like English and fine arts. And the last distinction we wanted to talk about a little bit was domestic versus international. So international programs tend to require that applicants have their master's first and have more pre-assigned PhD positions. So when we say pre-assigned PhD positions, it's usually like someone like a PI puts out a call saying like, I want, or I'm looking for a student who is interested in doing work on like how poverty affects like youth development or child development. And then so if you're interested in doing that work, like you would apply for that position. Whereas programs within the US do not always require that students have their master's, but some do. So that's something to check in about, just to make sure that like if you need a master's for the program that you want to apply to, beforehand before you apply. And then we also wanted to show some like screenshots in terms of like IDing types of schools. So one of the things that I did when I was applying is that I used a list from Wikipedia, and I know that Wikipedia is not always the best source for all of the things, but I did find it helpful using this Wikipedia list as like a first step to looking for programs. And so the list that I have screenshotted here is about as for R1 institutions. And if you go on the link at the bottom, the first one, and you scroll down, they also have lists of like R2 institutions. So institutions that have very high research activity. So some that are here are like schools like Boston University, Brown University, California Institute of Technology, Carnegie Mellon. And then they also have whether they're like public or private, if that's something that you want to know. And then this next screenshot is from the University of California, Irvine's MSI directory. So if you think you might want to go to a minority serving institution, there are lists out there of institutions that are considered MSIs. So for instance, like the Alabama Agricultural and Mechanical University is considered like an HBCU. So this is like a helpful list if you, again, think you might want to go to an MSI. And then the third is a link to a list or a screenshot of a list of liberal arts colleges. Again, you might have to do a little bit of digging to find which liberal arts colleges have grad programs. I tried to find a list, but I couldn't quite find one that were like, these are all of the ones that have grad programs. So you might have to do a little bit of digging for that. But this is like one place where you can potentially look. And then we also wanted to talk, now that we've talked a little bit about there's many types of schools, there are also many types of grad programs. And so the first one is more course-based master's programs. So usually in these, you're not doing really any research, you're mostly just doing coursework. And for these programs, you're only applying to the program and you're not applying to work with an advisor. And then we have rotations, which is where you apply to a program and you identify usually 2 to 4 research groups or labs that you could work with. And this is often done in like the natural or biological sciences. And then we have programs that are specifically direct admit. So you're applying to the program and you're applying to the program with the knowledge that you're going to have an advisor already set for you when you come in. And this is often done in the social sciences. So I'm into social science fields. So if folks want to know more about like navigating that, we'll talk about that later. And we can also answer questions about that. And then there's some programs where you do your courses and then you find an advisor. So you apply to the program, you take courses, and as you're taking courses, you then select your advisor partway through the program. And then again, just a tip or a note, each of these structures might require different application approaches. So just be aware of that. And then same thing again as we did before with the schools. We also have some screenshots for IDing the types of programs. So the first one is from Harvard's PhD program in biological sciences and public health. So as you can see in the screenshot here, they specifically have a page dedicated to talking about laboratory rotation. So it gives you a sense of like the number of lab rotations that students are usually expected to do, how to use selector rotations and things like that. So this page is a subset of another page. I think it's a PhD curriculum and milestones overview. So that's one place that you could look to find out this information. And then this next screenshot that I just put up, this is from the University of Michigan's psychology program, which is one of the programs that I'm in. And so here, if you look at I think it's the third paragraph, they make sure to tell you that you need to have a sense of who you might want to work with before you come. So this is more like for a direct admit program. So here where it says, as you are preparing to apply, it will be important to identify faculty who are carrying out research that matches your interests. And then you can identify faculty research interests on like the research page. So as you're looking at programs, you might want to look for texts such as like that tell you that like, hey, you need to have a sense of who you want to work with as you're applying. And then this last screenshot is also from the University of Michigan, but this time from the Computer Science and Engineering PhD program. And in the little blurb under an advisor, they kind of basically tell you that like as you're taking courses, you will also be in the process of selecting an advisor. So like here in your first year, your goal is to find an advisor with whom you have a good working relationship, to start research and to take classes. So that's all kind of happening simultaneously.
We also want to take a second and acknowledge the fact that there's many paths to doing grad school that make you a successful scientist. For some people, they might start from wherever they are now, whether that's in their final year of an undergrad or after a time off from their undergrad, and go to a master's program. And they might use that master's program then to launch themselves into a career. For other people, after a master's program, they might then take more time off or move to a PhD program at another university. Other folks might jump straight from their undergraduate degree or from time off from their undergraduate degree directly into a PhD program. There's also options to do master's along the way, or kind of continuing into a PhD from a master's program, usually at the same institution that you do a master's program in. And then finally, for some people, as they're pursuing their master's degree or a PhD, they might have an intent to get a PhD, but ultimately decide that it's not correct for their career goals or their self in that time. And so they might leave the program with a master's, even though they might have intended to do a PhD. As a graduate student, folks are balancing many different tasks. There's usually tasks that are typical or generally required. So these can be things like research or coursework. You'll also usually have a set of standard exams or milestones that are dependent on your program. And there's all sorts of really important other things that you get to do as a grad student. These are things like side research projects, social activities, internships, service activities. So outreach and activism and advocacy can all be part of a grad school experience. We want to take a pause here and ask folks if they have any questions on the admissions process or on the different types of programs. You can feel free to use the raise your hand feature or ask questions directly in the chat, whatever you're most comfortable with. If you do think of questions, feel free to add them along the way. We'll also have a big Q&A session at the end, so you can ask questions about anything that we cover during that time. Now we want to move into talking a little bit about graduate program fit. So there's many different things that you might be trying to balance as you're deciding what graduate program is right for you. Christina, we'll get to your question in just 1 second. So as you're applying to a graduate program, you might be thinking about things like, do I like the advisor that I could be working with or the research that I might do? Does this program have a great off-campus culture that makes me feel welcome? Is the location in the right spot? Do I have adequate funding to do this program? As well as many of the other things shown on this slide. It's also really important to remember that everyone is going to have different values, needs, and goals related to these components. So for one person, location might be super important, and that might be the thing that's most important to them. But for other people, the research topic might be the most important. And that's totally fine to have different needs and different prioritization of these different components of fit. So let's go ahead and take a pause. I see a couple questions in the chat. So Enrica, do you want to go ahead and read those off and then we can answer them?
Yep. So the first question is, how many schools on average do people apply to? Um, I will say it varies a lot. When I applied in fall 2019, I applied for 7 schools, but 8 programs. Because at the University of Michigan, I applied for 2 programs. So I applied for 8 programs in total. But I also know people who applied to less, more, depending on like for folks who I know of who apply for like, for instance, clinical psychology programs, they're applying for like 10 to 15 because they're really, really competitive programs. So I think it varies.
I would add on to that just by saying it can really depend on what sort of program it is. So in my field, ecology, it tends to be a direct admit program. So you have to have an advisor pre-selected beforehand. So in my case, I actually only applied to 4 schools because there were 4 professors who I was interested in working with. Versus people who are maybe doing a course-based program might apply to more schools because they don't have the limitation or prioritize research since that's not part of their degree program. So it can really vary a lot, just to echo what Rico was saying.
Next question is, I've heard that there are committee-based or faculty-based programs. I wonder if that's true and how do we find out?
I am not familiar with that language. If you'd want to expand a little bit on what that might mean, we could maybe try to address that. But I haven't heard that language before.
Yeah, I haven't either. So yeah, if we can get like a follow-up a bit about for this question, we can totally answer it. We can come back to that one. And then the next question is, I applied twice before for PhD programs and didn't get in anywhere. Should I mention this in this year's application, or is it something which won't matter? My field is physics, astrophysics. I think you could. I've heard of folks who talk about it and folks who don't talk about it. The one nice thing about like talking about it and like obviously like framing it in a way that like it kind of like shows that you're persistent, like you really are interested in applying for this program and being in this field. And so like even though it may not have worked out, like the first 2 times that you like again are really interested and you are hoping to try again to be admitted. So I don't think it could necessarily hurt to talk about the fact that you've applied before. I think it just depends on how you frame it. But Lori, what do you think?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think what's really important is that if you decide to bring it up, which is totally reasonable to do, that you're showing reflection and growth. So I applied last year, it maybe didn't work out, but these are the ways that I've grown, and these are the new things that I'm thinking about that make me a more fit candidate this year. Is one thing. And we'll also talk a little bit more about that once we get to the personal statement and research statement webinars as well. So those will come up later, and you should definitely come back for those to hear more about that. So just to answer the question that came back up in the chat, where should I mention previous difficulty getting into graduate school? You can do that in many places on your application, generally during your personal statement, and definitely come back for the Project Short webinar about personal statements to get more advice on that. Okay, so I'm gonna just come back to talking about grad school fit. So in addition to the kind of big picture needs and values that different grad schools promote and prioritize, there's also a lot of ways that programs vary in concrete ways. So some programs are bigger and some programs are smaller, as in they have more or less students. Programs can vary in career emphasis, in the length of time it takes to get your degree, in the number of courses or the course structure that you do in order to get your degree, and then also in the social culture of the department. And so thinking about all of these things can also be helpful in deciding if a place is the right fit for you or somewhere that you might like to apply. I also want to highlight that fit is really important. It's a great way to increase your happiness and motivation during your program. Grad school can be really challenging, and having a place that feels supportive and positive can help you get through those challenges and feel successful. The right fit can also provide appropriate professional development opportunities. So if you're in a program that really emphasizes government careers, for example, and you want a government career, that's helpful because it connects you into a great network to get that sort of job, compared to if you want an academic career and you're in that program that emphasizes government careers, you might have a mismatch between your professional network and the program's professional network, as well as the sorts of professional development opportunities that they provide. So fit really helps get you connected to the right people and make sure that you're motivated, happy, and meeting your goals. People find their graduate program in all sorts of different ways. So some people will use school websites if they have an idea of where they might want to go to get a sense of if it could be a good fit for them. Other people will use Twitter or social media, for example, by following conference hashtags or following professors to get a sense of if they might be interested in the sorts of research that are going on in a field, or if a specific professor has an open position that they might be interested in. You can also use word of mouth. So at conferences, you might meet someone who has a great research position available or who has potential funding for a graduate student. You might also talk to folks in your current network if there's schools that might be really good fits for you. And then for some people, they might have a really strong preference about location or their advisor or some dimension of the graduate school. And so they can use that to start to narrow down their list of graduate schools and find appropriate graduate schools. So again, you want to think back to what are your needs and your values, and how are they reflected in the school or program that you're potentially applying to? What are the things that are non-negotiable to you? And what are the things that you might care a little bit less about? So if everyone here just wants to put something in the chat that they think is really important to their graduate school fit, it could be anything that was listed or anything that you thought of. I'd love to hear the sorts of things that you guys are thinking about. Research fit and location, personality, program resources. So thinking a lot about professional development and network opportunities maybe, as well as funding. Those are all really great things to think about, and certainly things that I know many graduate students think about as they're trying to find the right place to do their research and pursue graduate school. Another note that I just want to make is that in your application materials, you'll want to identify why that program is the right fit for you. So you'll really need to be program specific in your application materials, and think about how that program is the right fit for both your research and your career goals. Take another pause here. Does anyone have questions on finding programs or the different types of programs? So we have a follow-up about the question. I've heard there are committee-based and faculty-based programs. I wonder if that's true, and how do we find out? And for clarification, there's some PhD admissions committees that make decisions versus PIs making decisions on if they want students or not. This will vary school to school quite a bit. So at some schools, a committee might have more say about which students get admitted, and at other schools, an advisor might be able to advocate for admitting a student more. To find that out, if you're in a program that does use a direct admit structure, so where you reach out to an advisor to see if they have openings, you can ask them about this directly. You can ask about what the admissions process is like and how much room there is for kind of them advocating for you. And you can also ask what sorts of things are important to emphasize in your application based on that. Did that answer your question?
Got a thumbs up.
Thank you very much.
And then we have another someone said research fit, expansive research and program, professional development opportunities, all really good things. And then someone had a question, a lot of schools on my list are a perfect research fit, but are in a college town. I prefer living in big cities, and some big city schools don't have a good research fit.
So it's definitely true that you might need to make some negotiations or compromises about what exactly you want. It can be really hard to find the absolute perfect school. And so sometimes that means deciding if research fit or location is more important to you. But it doesn't have to be completely all or nothing, right? So if there's a school that's in a big city that has a close research fit, maybe you can make that work and still be able to have a research program that you make that you like for yourself. And maybe if there's a place that has a really good research fit, but is not exactly in a big city, maybe it's nearby to a big city. And so that still allows you to have kind of a more ideal location while still having a really good research fit, kind of in either dimension that you go there.
And my experience was pretty much like the latter of what Lori just said. So I'm originally from a big city, but I am currently in a college town for grad school. But the city that I'm in is close to a bigger city. So I'm in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and Ann Arbor is very close to Detroit. And so like that's like a very big city. So yeah, I would agree with what Lori said. And you never know, you might like a college town. You never know. But yeah, I think definitely like if you prefer a big city, like being in a place that's a small city but close to a big city could be a nice happy medium.
I have another question about what Enrica mentioned that. So you mentioned you're living in a college town, Ann Arbor, and you travel to Detroit. So, do you know if it's feasible for in such situations to take a apartment in the big city and just travel to college town? Is it, or does that like hamper your research time or something like that?
You really good question. I think you can do that, but because I know folks who have done it, I would recommend though for like your usually like your first like 2 years or so. I know this is probably like field dependent, but like when you're taking classes and stuff, it's a little bit more helpful to be closer to the institution, like when you need to travel and stuff. If you end up in a place that like Michigan gets a lot of snow, sometimes traveling can get really difficult. Um, but I do think it's doable if you want to live, like, let's say, like you wanted to live in like Detroit and just travel to Ann Arbor, you could. I know people who have done it. I don't think it necessarily hampers your experience, especially, again, this is only one specific case of Ann Arbor and Detroit, but like Ann Arbor, Detroit are like 45 minutes of a drive, so it's not that far. So you could do it. I think it just depends, but you could.
Um, I would agree with that. I would also echo that some forms of research are going to be more mobile than others. So, for example, I do all my work is computational, and so I'm able to take time in places that I really love in order to do my research from afar. So, some advisors are really flexible on that, and some research lends itself to that really well. So, that's also another thing to consider.
Do you mind if I add something?
Yeah, go for it.
Hi, Sarah.
I think it's also really important to consider the fact that some of these programs are going to be 4, 5+ years. So, um, for example, if you're thinking of moving to a place that you're not quite comfortable with, you have to consider that this is a quite a commitment, and you have to ask yourself if you're going to be happy there long term. Um, and you can also refer to current graduate school students in the program to ask what their experience is like.
Yeah, definitely echoing Sarah about asking current grad students because I know folks who like moved to Ann Arbor to be at Michigan who are also from big cities and they hated it. So I think again, experiences vary. And like Sarah said, like it's like 4+ years in theory sometimes doesn't sound like a long time, but when you're in it, it definitely can feel like a long time. So definitely like either way, just being it's good to like be happy in the location that you're in, even though I know like some people care a lot about location, some don't, but wherever you end up, it's just good to be in a place that you are like Sarah said, comfortable in. We're getting more questions. Okay. Another question was how important is the location regarding to internship placement?
So I can speak to this a little bit from a couple of different perspectives. So I have friends who are in applied math in California and have done internships in Boston and in Japan. So you can definitely travel for internships in graduate school. I've done internships in Washington, so moving over a couple of state lines there. I think in terms of internship placement, the thing that's probably equally important as your geographical location is the sorts of connections that your research mentors have and the sorts of connections that the school have. So some research mentors have pre-established connections with particular groups, and that can make getting an internship easier. And so we'll talk about this a little bit later, but as you're talking with potential advisors, either before applications or during interviews, you can always ask about that sort of thing.
Mhm. And then another question was, are you allowed to submit multiple applications to different areas within the same department? For example, can you apply to professors in both the developmental psychology and clinical psychology areas? I would say yes, with an asterisk. I think it's very much school dependent, program dependent. I want to say, for instance, at Michigan, I think you can apply to more than one area. I think because I think my the project short mentee that I had last year, pretty sure applied to like was interested in applying to like two areas in the same department and ended up doing so. And there's also faculty here who do I think take students from like either. So I think you probably could, but that's something to like when you're looking at program websites, that's something to look at maybe at like the frequently asked questions page or like other pages to see if they mention that, because some schools might allow you to and others might not.
I'll also just say in some cases, people I know will apply to the same professor, but in different departments. So for example, at the University of California, Davis, we have graduate groups and professors are part of multiple graduate groups. So I could have applied to both the population biology graduate group and the ecology graduate group with the same prospective advisor. It just would have meant that my courses would have looked a little bit different. So that's kind of on the flip side of the question, another way to apply to graduate school sometimes.
And then if you are able to apply for like two areas of one department, you'll probably also want to talk about like specifically why you want to apply for like the clinical area, why you want to apply for the developmental area, just making it clear why you want to apply for each individually as well. And then does it reflect negatively if one applies to two different departments/programs in the same school? Example, physics and astronomy programs, or does it show an unclear vision? Sorry, Laura, do you want to go?
Yeah, I'll just jump in and say I think that you can totally apply to multiple departments and programs at the same school. You just need to make sure that your application materials are tailored to the specific department and program. So for example, in your case, you don't want to submit a physics application to an astronomy department. You want to submit a unique physics application and a unique astronomy application to each prospective department. And when I say unique, it doesn't have to be completely new materials, but it should have the focus of the department that you're applying to.
I would definitely agree. And adding another anecdote, the two programs that I'm in now, I applied for both of them at Michigan. So I did this, and like Lori said, I just made it so that so I applied for I'm in the communication and media and developmental psychology programs at Michigan. And so I just made sure that both of my statements and for each department reflected why I wanted to apply to both programs. And like Lori said, you don't necessarily have to make like write completely different statements for both departments. You might have to, depending on if they have different requirements for what they want. But I think most of my statements were the same, and I just made it clear why I wanted to apply for those specific departments or programs. But I will also say that's something that you'll have to check in about at the school, because I know there were some schools that I applied to for grad school that only allowed you to apply for one program and not two, but Michigan's one of the schools that allows you to apply for two. So that's just something to look out for as well.
Enrica, I had a follow-up with you. You mentioned you are doing a program in communication and psychology. So, I mean, to a layman like me who's not aware of the field, these two seem really different fields of study. So, did you have advisor in the communication program which did psychology, or vice versa in psychology who did communications? Is that why you applied, or is it something that if I'm interested in physics and I'm also interested in engineering, so I can apply for both?
Yeah. Really good question. So I applied for both because my research interests are very interdisciplinary and they reflect both fields. But it also just so happened that one of my advisors in the communication and media program is a social psychologist by training, and she's also affiliated with the psych department at Michigan. That didn't like factor in at the time. But yeah, the reason why I ended up applying for both is because my research interests are related to both fields. So if your like research interests are related to both physics and astronomy, that would be a totally understandable reason why you would want to apply um, for both.
Do you
Sarah's
mention
also
in your, I'm sorry, I just have one more. Do you mention in your, for example, in your psychology application that you're applying for communications too, or is that something you don't do?
Yeah, good question. I did not. I basically applied for each program individually. So when I applied for psych, I was like, this is why I'm applying for the psych program. And then when I applied for the comm program, I was like, this is why I'm applying for the comm program. But Michigan also has, and this, I think there are other schools that also, some other schools that also do this, but at Michigan, it's called an IIDP program. It's like interdepartmental individualized degree program. And so you can like, if your interests are interdisciplinary and you want to like basically be a joint student and put two programs together into one, you can do that. So if you're interested in that, that might be also something to look at. Either in like I think for Michigan, it was like on like a frequently asked questions page or somewhere. So like if that's something that you're interested in doing, you might want to look into that too. But it's also fine if you end up applying for both physics and astronomy programs and just want to do like physics or astronomy.
Sarah's also included some great information in the chat. We just want to make sure that everyone has a chance to read or hear that, which is most graduate programs have a contact person about admissions. And so you can always email them if you have questions. For example, if you want to ask if you can apply to multiple programs or if you can use one application fee to cover both applications. And so it's always really great to reach out to, sometimes they're called graduate coordinators or program coordinators, to get more information about specific schools, processes, and procedures.
All right, I think I don't see any other questions, so we can go on to the next slide, and then we can also continue to take questions as we go along. So now we're going to chat all about finding an advisor. We talked about finding a school, finding a program, and now we're going to talk about finding probably the single most important person that you're going to be like working with in grad school. And so again, how do I find an advisor? And so one way to find an advisor is that you can ask current mentors whether they know of any faculty members who would be a good research fit. So like, for instance, let's say like you're currently working in a lab, and the work that you're doing now, you want to continue doing in grad school, you can ask your advisors that you're working with now, like if they have any thoughts on people who you could like, it could work really well if you all work together because they usually will probably have ideas. Another tip is that as you read articles that you find interesting, you might want to take note of the researchers doing that work and see where they're located. So for instance, if you're really interested in a specific topic and the person that is doing this work is in like the chemistry department at like the University of Georgia, that might be one of the programs you might want to look into. Social media is also a good place to find an advisor. So following conference hashtags and PIs in the field. Sometimes I've noticed that like PIs will also say, not all the time, but some of them will say that like, hey, like I'm recruiting students or like hoping to get a student this next cycle. So that's one way to find an advisor. And then society job postings can also be really helpful. So many professional societies or like organizations, such as like the Ecological Society of America, have email aliases or job boards for master's or PhD positions. So that can be helpful. Another helpful approach to looking for an advisor. Another thing, really important thing is to check program websites to see the work that professors are doing. Most times when you go on the program websites, they'll have like a little blurb about like each professor's research. Another helpful thing is to maybe also check the sections on the lab website. So usually lab websites are listed for a particular professor on their program website. And they might have tabs such as join the lab and resources for potential grad students, but these are not always updated. There are some advisors who are like really good at updating their websites, like to the point where like they'll post like, hey, I'm taking a student this upcoming year, I'm not. And then there's advisors who haven't updated theirs in like 5 years. So I would say scope around a little bit and you can kind of tell if it's been updated recently, like if they have like a publication section, if you see some like recent pubs, it's likely that they've like recently updated. But if it looks like things are kind of old and it hasn't been updated, then it might not be the most helpful place. And then program websites do not list whether professors are accepting new grad students for the upcoming application cycle. Email them to find out. Again, some program websites, they will have like just like a little sentence like this person's taking students, this person's not. But in my experience, it seems like most of them don't necessarily list that. And so you'd want to email just to double check to see who's accepting students. And then some other things to note, if application deadlines are in December, reach out mid-October. If deadlines are earlier, like in November, reach out now for sure. And then another thing to note is that some advisors schedule like mini interviews after a student first reaches out to them. However, this is very field dependent. For some fields, it is expected that students have informal interviews with potential advisors, but not for others. So I know Lori and I were talking before, and she had mentioned that in her field, like it is expected that like mini interviews will happen. But for my field, it can be like very advisor dependent, but in my experience, it mostly doesn't happen. So again, field dependent, could be also advisor dependent. It might also be one thing that happened with me is that I applied for a program that does not do interviews, but the PI that I would work with, she did sort of like a mini interview with me. She like sent me like a paper of hers that she wanted us to talk about and just to get a sense of like how I think about research and stuff. So that could happen. So not necessarily a mini interview, but like sort of something like that. So like that's something to be aware of. And then make sure that there are multiple professors you are interested in working with at each program you apply to. And that's for a number of reasons. One is that for some fields, or like if you're doing rotations, like having two possible advisors is really important and necessary. And then it also allows you to foster really great research collaborations with faculty members who are not your advisor. And so I've done research with other faculty members who I don't directly work with. And it's also helpful when you're later down the line, when you're starting to put together your dissertation committee. It's helpful to like already have people around you who you can potentially ask to be on said committee. Okay. And then now I wanted to share screenshots of an email. And this specific email is the one that I sent when I was applying for programs. And I reached out to, I think it was 18 professors with this email and also a follow-up email that I'll show on the next slide. And I heard back from all but one of them. So I think it was pretty solid, not to say it's the best email ever, but it's pretty solid. So what I ended up doing was that so the two is like whoever the potential advisor's email is, and the subject that I use is prospective student inquiry. I applied in fall 2019, but I just updated this in fall 2021 for something else. So I said, Dear Doctor, professor's last name, my name is so-and-so, and I recently graduated from this college university in month year, only year with degree earned. And obviously you like change this as you see fit for your own situation. I said, I'm interested in pursuing this degree, which led me to look into this university in your lab. I was really excited when I came across your work since one of my main research interests is your research interest and how this influence may lead to topic in your field that is linked to your research interest in the professors. This interest blossomed from the work that I did with Dr. So-and-so through whatever this lab experience was. And again, you can change this how you see fit. And this year where we analyzed whatever you analyzed. And then I said, I believe that my interests align well with the work produced by your lab, particularly the research on this specific topic. I really enjoyed your recent publication on this topic and would love to research similar topics to further our understanding of whatever topic you think needs to be studied more. And I was wondering whether you'll be accepting new graduate students into your lab for you all to be like fall 2025. So if so, I've attached my CV and a bit more about my background and the work that I've done for your consideration. Thank you so much for your time. And so one thing I tried to do was I tried to make the email informative about who I was, but I also try not to make it super long. But I also try to show them that like I actually read their work, actually knew the work that they do. One of the things I've heard from faculty members when they don't answer these types of emails is because the student hasn't really shown that like they know the work that they do. It just seems like they sent the same like boilerplate like email to everyone. So you really, if you particularly for direct admit programs, and programs where you need an advisor as you're coming into a program, like it is really helpful when you show them that like you know what work they're doing, you know like how you see your work fitting with theirs. And then if you send out an email or this email and you don't hear back I would, in terms of like sending a follow-up email, I would wait 2 weeks. That's what I did. A week is a little bit too soon because sometimes like, and as a grad student, like we could probably like we all know that like you get a lot of emails sometimes, and sometimes like emails just get buried. And so I would say, in my opinion, wait 2 weeks before you send a follow-up email. And this was my follow email. So I sent this email in the same thread that I sent the initial email. And so they can see that like, hey, like you reached out to them before, but now you're sending another one. And so again, to potential advisor, well, you won't have to put a new subject because it'll be the same subject. So I said, Dear Dr. So-and-so, I am following up regarding an email that I sent about 2 weeks ago. I realize that your schedule is probably very busy, but would greatly appreciate any information that you can provide in relation to my following question. I hope to apply to this program at this school. Excuse me. I'm highly interested in your lab. Will you be accepting new graduate students for fall 2025? And this is just like my thought. Laura, you can say if you have another thought. After there was one professor who didn't answer my first or second email. I didn't send another one after that. So I didn't send like a third or fourth email. I just kind of left it at 2 and just didn't send another one.
Yeah. So I know people who have sent free emails with the advisor that they work with now. Sometimes things do happen. Emails just get buried. If they're the person that you are absolutely certain that you want to work with, or you think that they would be the most perfect fit in the world for you, you can email 3 times if you need to. One thing to remember is that there's a lot of advisors out there, and you might be surprised at who's actually a really good fit for you or who works really well for you. So you might be surprised when you do follow up with advisors. They might turn out to be a really great fit, and then you might not need to email so many.
Yeah, and sometimes I will. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Lori.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say sometimes when advisor or when potential advisors don't respond to emails because something happened and they forgot. Like the one of my advisors, like currently, she told me that like when I initially emailed her, she was about to answer, and then someone started talking to her and she got distracted, and that's why she didn't answer. And so when I sent her the follow-up email, she was appreciative because she just got distracted. So sometimes that happens too.
I also just want to point out a couple of really important things about Enrica's first email. So 3 things that I noticed that are really important is 1, the subject line is informative. So it says prospective student inquiry for the quarter that you'd be applying for. And then it starts with Dear Dr. Professor, right? You don't want to say, hey there, Joe. This is a formal email inquiry. So starting with Dear Doctor and then their last name is definitely appropriate. And I really want to echo what Enrica said, which is that showing that you have a specific interest in their lab and their research is really the key to this email and getting the response to the email. So being really clear about how you think your research overlaps with their research and what sorts of things you might be excited to pursue in their lab is really important for this email.
And one other quick thing to note is that if there's someone that you really, really want to work with and you like, again, you're, for instance, in a direct admit program and you need an advisor beforehand and they're just not answering, one thing that you could do potentially is to reach out to the graduate coordinator and see if they know who's accepting students. Sometimes they do. So that might be a way to find out, but other times they don't. So it might not work, but that's a potential option too, because sometimes they'll like have a sense. And then another way, again, if professors don't answer, that you can kind of get a sense that they might be taking a student, but this can vary widely, is that if you like, let's say you're looking at like the current grad student page, and because some of the current grad student pages for programs will have when students got admitted and who they worked with. At least in my experience, this might be different based on funding and stuff, but if an advisor took like or accepted one or two students the year prior, they're slightly less likely to take a student the following year. Now that again, if they have funding to like support another student, they might take another student. But in my experience, at least in the two fields that I'm in, usually if a professor takes like one or two students, like let's say last year, they may not take a student the year after, but they could.
Mhm.
Uh,
We also have just a question in the chat. Can it seem repetitive if your name is attached to your email? I'm not quite sure where you're referring to in the email, but I will say I still email people with my last name in the subject line. My last name is my email, and I end with "Thank you, Lori Volstead." So I wouldn't stress too much about that kind of level of detail. But if you are concerned about it, you can always just sign off with your name at the end, and that's totally fine.
Professors often don't have a lot of time, so you want to make the email as clear and as simple as possible. So get straight to the point, your name, your background, why you're interested. So I think it's fine to say it twice.
I would agree. It's also funny, like sending these types of emails because obviously, like well, at least I was so stressed sending this email because you want it to be like just right. And then sometimes you get just a quick response back, like, yeah, I'm taking students. So like we put so much effort into these emails and like professors just send like a really quick uh email back that maybe is not as like formal as ours. So that's sometimes like kind of funny when that happens. Um, okay. I will go on to the next couple slides, but again, if there's any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. Okay.
So one thing that we just wanted to highlight is that advisors vary in many, many ways. So for example, some advisors will have different levels of involvement in different parts of your research. They might have different degrees of flexibility in terms of your research topic or your work style, like when you come into the office. Obviously, every advisor will have a different personality, a different communication style. Different advisors might also vary in terms of their ability to support your professional development goals and their ability to support your research. And so all of these dimensions are really important to think about as you think about your fit with your advisor.
We have a question in the chat. So if I know a professor is taking students this cycle, is it still helpful to email this professor and introduce myself?
I think it
Okay.
really varies by field. In my field, if a professor hasn't expressed, so I'm in ecology and evolution, and in my field, if a professor hasn't specifically expressed interest in working with you, it's oftentimes not worth applying to the program. So it is good to reach out to professors to get a sense of if they'd be interested in working with you, at least for my field. But that's not necessarily the case for other fields. And I've had experience with that as well.
Yeah, and then I was gonna say, again, at least for the programs that I'm in, I would say if I knew a professor was taking students, I didn't email them to introduce myself because basically the main question that I wanted my answer to, I already like had the answer for. However, I will say, you could still email them to introduce yourself, but I would also make sure, again, at least like for instance, if you're interested in applying for a social science program, at least in my experience, like if you're still gonna email, I would maybe like have a question that you want to ask. One thing that you could ask is that like in terms of like the research that they're doing, if it's not super clear, if like for instance, like let's say you want to do research that you like looked at their Google Scholar, you saw the work that they were doing, but maybe you want to know like, are they interested in still wanting to continue this line of research or are they deciding to shift? Because sometimes professors do shift their research. So professors who may have been a good fit, like maybe like 3 years ago when they were doing this work, they might not be doing completely different work now. So that might be like a question to ask. Again, this if you're applying for like more social science programs, and again, I like Lori mentioned, like different programs do and different departments and different fields do things differently. So yeah.
I think it's also, so if you're getting the information about like a professor taking students from a program website, it's also worth sending an email because like Enrico was saying earlier, those websites aren't always up to date. And so the professor might not respond, but at least you'll have asked and you'll at least kind of be in their head when they're reading applications potentially. So I don't think it ever hurts to email, is my impression. I also just want to point out while we're on this slide that advisors vary in many ways. I think it's actually really great and exciting that advisors vary in many ways because this means that there is probably an advisor out there who is a great fit for you. And that's, I think, really exciting to know that there's someone out there who's going to be great for your research and great at supporting you and advocating for you throughout your graduate school experience. And so you should always feel confident with the advisor that you choose and know that there's definitely an advisor out there somewhere for you. So again, this high variation in types of advisors mean that every advisor does things a little bit differently and is looking for something different in their students. So in my field, every advisor might have a different way of responding to inquiry emails or doing initial meetings if they do initial meetings with students. And so I think one of the most important things as you're reaching out over email and as you start interviewing with professors or after applications, if you're doing in-person interviews, is to be yourself, because you want an advisor who responds positively to the authentic you and is going to be willing to support and advocate for the true you as you're going through graduate school. So as you meet with potential advisors, again, field dependent if you're maybe talking with them more directly, or as you talk with them after the admissions process, there are a couple of different things that you might ask about when meeting with potential research advisors. So we've listed a couple of categories here. So things like research. This can be like, what sorts of topics is the lab exploring? How do students choose their research questions? Next, we have mentorship. So things like, how often do you tend to meet with your students? What do you do to support a positive lab culture? What sorts of positions do your students take after graduating? For mentorship, sometimes as helpful as it can be to talk to advisors directly, it can also be really helpful to talk to their graduate students to get a sense of what their mentorship style might really be like. Next, we have funding. So you can ask questions like, how are students usually funded in your lab? Are students expected to get their own funding for their research materials or for their conference travels? What courses do your students typically TA or act as teaching assistants for? And then finally, you can also ask about the program more broadly. What sorts of courses do students tend to take in this program? When are students completing their milestones? What's the application process like? Are there any courses that I need to show that I've taken for the application process? Those things are all totally okay to talk about with professors as you're applying to programs. And then remember, these first meetings with professors are conversations, so you can totally share about yourself. And this might mean sharing about your research experience. For example, what sorts of research experiences have you had? What research would you want to do? What sorts of research skills do you have? And what skills are you looking forward to developing in graduate school? Next, we have career goals. So these are things like, what are your future goals? And how does your graduate degree maybe contribute to that? And then finally, your background. So this can be relevant background that's led to your research interests, and how your past experiences have helped prepare you for graduate school and beyond. We just want to take a second to acknowledge that there might be some things that you want to watch for. So these can sometimes be called red flags. So these are things like if there's no clear funding plan or that the professor expects you to TA for the entire time, this can be a bit field dependent. So in some fields, it's much more common that you're going to be TAing regularly. And in other fields, that might be indicative of an advisor who doesn't have quite enough funding for all their students. If the grad students that are already in the lab are unhappy, it's worth finding out why they're unhappy and thinking about if that's going to be the right place for you. And then finally, if you're not comfortable with the advisor when you meet with them, that's a sign that they're maybe not the right person for you. And it can be for any reason that you're not comfortable with them. Everyone has their own needs and personal feelings. And they're totally valid.
Just one super quick note. If you, particularly about the graduate students in lab, are unhappy, if you ask an advisor, would they be willing to connect you with their grad students, and they say no, could put not always, but it could potentially be a red flag because maybe they know that like the lab culture isn't the best, and they know that like grad students, we're usually very honest, so like if the lab culture isn't the best, we'll usually tell you. And so sometimes, so like if you ask an advisor like, hey, can I talk to some of your students, or like would you be willing to connect with some of your students, and they're like no, or they're really like kind of like shifty about it, potential red flag, might not be potential.
We also want to highlight some green flags. Not everything is doom and gloom. So some different things that can be indicative that you have a potential really good fit with an advisor are things like they talk openly about funding options for you. They're excited when they talk to you, and they encourage you to talk with their students, just like Enrico was saying. And then finally, they're supportive of your goals. So again, you want someone who's going to be supportive and excited to work with you. I want to take a second and just acknowledge too that everyone is going to have their own red and green flags. So what we've listed, nothing is set in stone here. These are just things that can generally be indicative of potential problems or potential really good fits. But based on your own needs and values, you'll kind of decide what is more or less important to you in an advisor. So just kind of want to point out a little quick tip here, which is for research-based programs, your research statement should include information about who you might want to work with. So even if you're doing rotations and you don't necessarily have those assigned yet, you want to give an indication of who you might be able to work with. And then for direct admit programs, you want to say which advisor you're interested in working with and talking about how their work or how your work will complement their lab's work and how their lab will support you. So it's really important, again, to be tailoring your research statements and your personal statements to the specific school and sometimes even the specific advisor at a school. We want to end with a really important note, which is that there's many reasons why someone might not be accepted into a graduate program. And they're very often about funding or a mentoring match and not a reflection of your capability to do research or your past accomplishments. So we just really want to make sure that everyone recognizes that as they're going into this admission cycle. I think you guys are all really capable of doing research, and I'm really excited that you guys want to be graduate students, and I'm really hopeful that you find an amazing fit for yourself.
Absolutely, definitely just want to plus one what Lori said, and also wanting to say that like just again like it is not you. Like for instance, like another anecdote, there was a program that I pretty much like I interviewed and everything, and I pretty much like got into the program, but the reason why I didn't like officially like fully get it is because the main professor who was the best fit for me to work with was switching institutions at that same exact time that I was applying, and I didn't like apply to like the other institution where she was going to end up at. So I didn't end up officially getting into the program because the other person I would have worked with, it just wasn't a good fit. So like sometimes like again, it's like people switch institutions, people like things happen. So again, definitely not a reflection of you in any way.
Now we want to take a couple minutes to have questions on finding and reaching out to potential advisors, and we can also have broader Q&A during this time if you guys do have further questions. Again, feel free to use the chat feature or use the raise your hand and speaking feature. So as you guys are typing out your questions, I just want to let you guys know that an email with the slides is going to be sent out following this event. And so you're welcome to review all of these materials. There's also going to be additional workshops, and you can always talk to your project short mentor more about the topics that we've covered here today. I see someone with a hand raised. Do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, thank you for hosting the session. It's been very helpful. I have a question about reaching out to the potential advisors. So if I have two advisors that I'm interested in, is it okay if I email them at the same time, or should I wait for like maybe 1 or 2 weeks to email them separately?
I would email both at the same time. I know sometimes it feels weird because it's like, oh, will like someone get mad? Like, will one like person get mad that I emailed the other person? Usually faculty members are like, they understand that like, you want to make sure there's multiple people that you can work with in the program. So yeah, totally like feel free to send emails to both of them at the same time. But making sure that they're specific to like the professor that you're emailing, so you don't like like as we talked about, like not sending the same exact email to both people, but definitely like feel free to reach out to both at the same time.
Yeah. I was really nervous about that when I was reaching out to advisors. I thought, oh, I need to email just one person at a time. But what I ended up realizing, which is still true, is you're going to end up applying to multiple programs. And so you'll want to have reached out to multiple people so that you can know which programs are worth applying to, make sense to apply to.
Yeah, thank you. That's exactly my concerns.
And we have a question in the chat. When emailing current graduate students in the lab, what's the best way to email them? Would it be somewhat similar to reaching out to a potential advisor? Yeah, so I've had students reach out to me who were interested in working with one of my current advisors. So yeah, it could be like you could reach out to, if you have a sense of like, if again, like let's say you're applying for a direct admit program, if there is an advisor that you might want to work with, like you could reach out to, again, it depends on like not all websites have who students work with, but if they do, you can like maybe reach out to the student or to students who work with your potential advisor to be like, hey, like I'm a prospective student and I just wanted to know if we can like chat a bit about like your experience in the program. And I just had some questions too. I don't want to speak for all grad students, but I love getting those and I always try to like respond to those. Obviously like there are folks who are busy and like who may not answer, but one way to do it is to reach out to students who work with an advisor that you would like to work with. I've also had other students reach out to me who were just interested in applying for the program in general and not necessarily with my specific advisor. So yeah. Any other questions?
If you guys do think of other questions, you can always feel free to reach out to us or your project short mentor. But with that, then I think that we'll go ahead and wrap up our recording. We'll stay on for a couple extra minutes if folks do think of last minute questions.